Hello, I'm going to talk to you today about how your food gets digested. So, first of all, we need a food substance that is going to be essentially our example for today. And what I'm going to choose as my food subject is a grilled cheese sandwich. There's a couple of reasons I'm choosing a grilled cheese sandwich. One, they're pretty delicious, although I barely eat them anymore because I don't eat bread. But the other reason is because a grilled cheese sandwich contains all of the things I care about digesting. So it contains bread, which has easy to digest starches and maybe slightly harder to digest starches like fiber. It has fats. For example, the butter or mayo you may have grilled your cheese in. So on the bread there are fats, and also in the cheese there are fats. And there's also proteins in the cheese. So it's got all the bits and pieces you would normally have. All right. You also get to enjoy my awesome artwork, which is actually terrible, while I go through this process. So let's talk about what happens with this grilled cheese sandwich. First of all, let me draw you a grilled cheese sandwich. Vump! That's my grilled cheese sandwich. It actually kind of looks like a piece of bread, so I'm gonna go with it. Maybe I'll even give it a nice grilled color, like I actually grilled it. Beautiful. It's my grilled cheese sandwich. All right, so what's the first thing that you do with food? Well, the first thing that you're going to do is you're going to chomp on it. So you're going to take that bit of food and you're going to put it between your teeth and you're going to break it into small pieces. So that's key thing number one, is in fact that you mechanically, as in physically take it apart, break down the food pieces. And I will draw these pieces of bread here that you are mechanically chomping down on. And again, probably pieces of cheese as well. That's why it's a grilled cheese sandwich. And they're now in the mouth in smaller pieces. Your tongue does some of this too by pushing up against it, but the tongue has a more important role that we'll get to in a moment. So first thing is to tear stuff into small parts and crush them up. Not a whole lot else is going on with your teeth. It's all physical. But there is some other stuff in your mouth. So in your mouth is saliva. And in the saliva are these real cute little enzymes called amylases. And so since they're enzymes, they're going to chop up something. In this case, I'm going to draw them like little Pac-Man. Hey, look, amylase is a little Pac-Man, because what he's going to do, there's another one. What he's going to do is he is going to chop up these bits of bread into even smaller pieces. And specifically, what the amylase does, is it breaks the starch into sugars. It's actually a really neat little thing you can do if you take a cracker. This works particularly well with like a Ritz cracker or something else that's typically very savory. You put a bit of that cracker in your mouth and let it just dissolve a little bit in the saliva. You can actually taste the sugar. And in fact, if you have sugar testing strips for something, you can actually like break the cracker down in water and it won't do that, and break it down in your mouth and you can actually test for the little sugar molecules, which is kind of cool. So it starts doing that. The only thing that gets broken down really in the mouth is starches. There might be a few other little things, but this is the main one. All right, so next up is that the food is in your mouth. It can't stay there for too long. You don't have a whole lot of mouth space, so it needs to get pushed somewhere else. This is now where your tongue really gets involved. Is your tongue, which by the way extends surprisingly far down the back of your throat, does the next job, which is to take those bits of food and push them into the esophagus by a process of swallowing. So you swallow the food and it goes into the esophagus. Where's the esophagus? There it is. And that's where it's going to go. The first part of swallowing you get to choose to do. So when you push something back, you start the process of swallowing. The second part, your tongue does all by itself. So you aren't actually involved. So typically if you get something far enough back in your tongue, your body then tries to swallow it. Which is why if you get something stuck somewhere, it can feel really weird because your body's trying to reflexively continue to swallow or continue to push back, and it's hard to gauge. Your esophagus, if you'll recall, is actually behind, at least from this direction, your trachea. And so your trachea is closer to your mouth than your esophagus is. And if you'll also recall, there's a neat little thing that covers up the trachea while you swallow called the epiglottis. All right, so before I move anything around, let me make sure I include a couple of these other things. Epiglottis, I can spell, and esophagus. Right back there. Okay, so now we're gonna have the bits of food gather up together, and they've, you know, at this point, some of them are broken down and some of them haven't, but at least they're small because they've mechanically been broken down, and they'll go into the esophagus. And typically you swallow things as a cluster. So it's a soft cluster and it's a small cluster, but it's still a cluster, and it goes down. And the esophagus is a very small tube that has a whole bunch of muscle around it. So around the esophagus, Vump is smooth muscle whose job it is to squeeze this bit of food down. We call the bit of food a bolus. And when the esophagus squeezes, it'll actually push around the food, pushing it down to the thing. So sometimes you'll actually see the muscles drawn in such a way that they really squeeze in and get that bit of food pushed down and down and down. And actually this works no matter what direction you're going. So it's not as easy, but you can eat lying down, you can eat upside down, you can do all kinds of stuff because these muscles push it in. And the process of your muscles pushing food or food type particles to a place called peristalsis. Peristalsis. I don't think I spelled that right. Let me try that again. Peristalsis. That's much better. And that pushes the food all the way down into your stomach. All right, I need a new page, so I'm going to clear this up. Now we're going to put the food in the stomach. Here's our esophagus, and the food is going to go right into the stomach. So here is your stomach. It's actually one of the things I'm fairly good at drawing. It has a really interesting shape, but also it expands and contracts, so it moves around a lot. And it also has a pretty good muscle layer all around it, because it also does a job of squishing the food around. All right, so let's get that food down here into the stomach. So it's coming down through peristalsis, then it's entering the stomach. And there'll be a bunch of it in here usually for a period of time, because the goal is for it to actually do some digesting in the stomach. While the stomach is squishing and moving around, the food stays there because there is a nice tight little opening, squeezing part here called a sphincter that keeps the stomach shut, except when something is coming down, and then squeezes it shut again. And it's got a sphincter as well at the bottom to help keep the food in until it is time to release it. So these are just muscles that squeeze these tubes tight and then let them open again. And if this top one doesn't work quite right and it lets things splash back up, that's how somebody might have heartburn. So let's talk about the stuff that's actually inside of the stomach. So first of all, we've got the food that you've added to it. That food, mostly digested food, it's a new name. It is called chyme or chyme. I've heard it both ways. And that's the stuff that's still in there. It gets mixed with a couple of other things. It gets mixed with acid and it gets mixed with enzymes. In this case, the main enzyme is pepsin. Okay, so now that I've written those three things down, I can talk about each of them. So I'm gonna start with the acid. So there is acid. I always draw acid like lightning bolts because I feel like that's how I feel about acid, like it strikes like lightning. The main job of the acid, well, it helps break up molecules in general, but specifically, it's very good at sort of breaking apart pieces of fiber and sort of remaining carbohydrates. So the acid does that. It helps to separate out fiber and especially like soluble versus insoluble. It can also help to sort of nail down certain proteins because they change shape in acidity. It also kills any other random shit that has gotten into your body. So that's important as well. Then the pepsin is another enzyme. And in this particular case, it's an enzyme that breaks down proteins. Since it is another enzyme, I'm going to make it another Pac-Man guy. But since it breaks down proteins, it's a little bit like It's not really a stronger enzyme, but I feel like it's going after a bigger, stronger thing. So these Pac-Man guys have little X's for eyes because they're crazy, because they break down proteins. So that's what's mostly happening in the stomach, is it's more mechanical digestion. So just in case you swallowed larger pieces, they will physically come apart. So once the molecules are physically separated from each other, which the acid also does, they become chemically broken down by the acid and by the pepsin if they are still starches, fibers, or proteins. So the vast majority of protein is pretty much broken down by the time you are out of the stomach. And interestingly enough, they've actually shown evidence of this where people who eat mostly protein have very little that moves on into their intestines, which is kind of funky. Now, the fibers get partially broken down, but there are still a number of undigestible fibers that will move on into the intestines. All right, so that is the main process of things that is happening in the stomach. So now we're going to go ahead and move on some more. All right, from the stomach, we move into the small intestine, which is broken down into parts. It's squished all up in the body, so I'm not going to draw it squished all up. I'm going to draw it a little bit more wide and open so we can see that there's, you know, a tube that it's going, but it's much, much longer than that. All right, so the first part of the tube is called the duodenum. I also really like the names of the small intestine pieces. And this is where we're finally going to get to the rest of the breakdown, because we have broken down our starches and we've done some stuff with our fibers and the rest of our carbohydrates. We have broken down our proteins, but we have not yet broken down our fats. All right, so there's a couple things that need to be done here. First of all, we need to take care of the acid problem from the stomach. So the stomach has a very, very high acidity and a very low pH. So when it moves into the intestines, your pancreas produces bicarbonate, which you might remember is similar to baking soda, which brings the pH up, actually brings it way up. So if your stomach is down in like 1.5 or 2, your intestines are way up at like 9 and 10. It's actually a pretty dramatic change. And this is partially because of the fats. It helps to digest those things. The fats are also helped to be digested by a substance called bile. So bile salts are the main way that we're able to digest fats. Let me talk a little bit about bile. Bile salts are produced in the liver. They're stored in the gallbladder if you have extra of them. You don't need the gallbladder to store them, but it helps if you eat a lot of fat. You kind of want to dump a lot of bile salts on it at once. So if our fats, so I'm going to make our fats, let's see, kind of orangey because they were probably part of the cheese. And they're still in fairly large pieces, come down into here. The bile salts are actually like these little pieces of soap. They're tiny little soap molecules, and they're built very similarly to actual soap, which is that soap has sort of a fatty string and a little salt or ionic piece attached to it. And what happens is the tails of the little soap particles stick in to the fat because they have little hydrophobic fatty tails, and the salts stay on the outside in the basic solution, and they pull the fat particles apart and start to break down the actual fatty acids. So most of the time these are in larger things and they'll be able to break them down. So these little bile salts come in and break apart all those little fats so that all you have left are much more digestible fatty acid type pieces. All right, so at this point we've broken everything that's digestible down into digestible parts. And there are still some, again, undigestible things sort of floating around. Most of them are fibers and stuff like that. Now we're going to pick up the stuff that we want. So the digestible bits are small enough to intake through the walls of the intestine into the body. So that moves us into the next part of the intestine, which is the jejunum, and then followed by the ileum. Jejunum. And ileum, and I'm not going to designate the different things that happen in these two areas. It's mostly picking up of nutrients and moving and packing of undigestible type fibers. This is where things are cool though, because the walls of the intestine here have kind of a neat thing going on to help pick stuff up. So if I was to take this section of the wall and zoom in on it, what I would actually see are these large villi or fingers that stick into the space of the small intestine of the jejunum and allow for the different particles to be picked up. They have blood vessels right around, let me get my red for blood vessels, kind of right on the insides next to them. So the next layer outside of the epithelia are the blood vessels. And so the tiny little food particles are able to go through the single columnar cell layer and enter the bloodstream. So this is where the good stuff gets into the bloodstream. So your tiny things, your fatty acids, your sugars, your amino acids, so they can travel to where they're going to go. Throughout the entire small intestine, you still have a process of peristalsis. So all these bits of food and liquid and things are continuously being pushed by your smooth muscles along through here. And, you know, depending on what you ate, it could be more or less trouble. All right, so at this point, we have digested all of our major food types. We have absorbed all of the important macronutrients, micronutrients, all of the other things that you can actually absorb into the bloodstream. And all that's left is the stuff you want to get rid of, the generalized waste products. So where do they go? Well, the waste products move from the small intestine. So maybe the small intestine is, you know, spinning around into the large intestine or colon. Voomp. So here's my little crappy drawing of the large intestine or colon, which loops. It's interesting actually, because it does actually loop up and around and then drops down at the very end here where it's going to exit the body. So our food particles are still there, still, like I said, some hanging around of various kinds. So they're moving through and they're getting into here. And the ones that are left might still have some water attached. And so one of the big things that happens here in the colon is that water, H2O, is removed. Here, I'll make this one a cute little water droplet, and reabsorbed back into the body. So the stuff that goes out at the end, some of it will still have some liquid. You don't want to have no liquid, but you don't want it to be super wet. Diarrhea is not what we're going for. We're going for dry, standard sort of defecation. All right, so everything collects over here in the rectum area. And when you have an appropriate collection in the rectum area, then the sphincters at the bottom of there, the anus, will open and release that material. So that's mainly what you've got in this area. And then it goes away. Yay. And that is the whole process of digestion, from your teeth, your tongue, your amylase, down your esophagus into your stomach to break down the fiber with the acid and the proteins with the pepsin into the intestines to break down the fat with the bile, absorb everything through the villi of the intestine, and then your extra waste products are collected, somewhat dehydrated in the colon, and released as feces through the anus. So I'll give you the terminology that goes with this: colon, rectum, anus, and that's pretty much the end of that. Oh, neat point. Over between where the small intestine and the large intestine meet is also kind of where your appendix is hanging out. And we used to not really have an idea of what the appendix was supposed to be for, but now we're pretty sure that it is a home for all the little bacteria that live in your digestive system. So I mentioned mostly the chemical digestion processes that are going on, but in both the small intestine and the large intestine, there are a lot of bacteria that are doing digestion as well. They are eating some of the foods that your body cannot chemically digest. They are leaving you with nutrients in many cases. Vitamin K comes almost exclusively from the bacteria in your gut in some manner. And they do a good job of breaking down the stuff that is otherwise difficult to break down. And you need those bacteria. Without them, your body literally does not digest food. And so many of them live in the appendix, and when the digestive system gets itself in trouble or wiped out for some reason, like with antibiotics, or something goes through that just messes with the bacteria, they can re-inoculate from the appendix. It's not necessary, but it is useful. All right, there's just one more thing related to the digestive system that I'm going to talk about, which is how the digestive system layers are built for the tube. So the digestive system, first of all, is one big tube. So from the point that it goes in the mouth, you can actually follow the entire thing through just one tube with just these little things that squeeze it shut, all the way down the esophagus, the stomach, then the intestines, and out again. And that tube is built in a very similar way, although the inside and outside portions of it look a little different at different places. It has 4 major layers. The fully inside layer is the mucosa layer. It can either be a little bit smooth, like for example in the top parts or in the stomach, or it can have the villi, for example, in the intestines. This layer, as I mentioned, is the mucosa. Here, I'll color code things. Mucosa, and it is made mainly of epithelial tissue. Because that is the tissue that lines stuff. And a lot of that lining, so up at the top, there are more layers of it. It's a little bit more stratified. And then as you get further down, it becomes less because we want to actually be able to get things through. So it's a simple layer in the intestine where you want stuff to go through the layer. All right. You might recall what I actually said was next after that, because next after that is how we're able to pick up and absorb the foodstuffs. So the next layer after that is actually a blood vessel layer. So it's got blood vessels in it. And that layer, because it is right next to the mucosa, is called the submucosa. And it is made of blood vessels and other, I remember what kind of tissue this would be, connective tissues. In this case, a lot of special connective. It's not overly tight connective, it's more squishy. So that's what's there. All right. What might be the next layer? Well, we're going to need the part that actually does the process of peristalsis, so helping to push things along. If we're pushing and squeezing and moving, it must be a muscle layer. So the next layer all the way around is indeed a muscle layer. It is fabulously called the muscularis because, you know, we're good at naming things, biologists, and it is a layer of muscle. So that is 1, 2, 3 of the layers. There's one more along the outside. I can finally make this one a slightly different color that helps to tightly hold everything together. Boom. And this is a fibrous connective layer called the serosa. And this one I will color code. Serosa, which is fibrous connective tissues. Your digestive system is actually pretty well held together, and that fibrous connective tissue connects it not only to itself in various places, but to the inside portions of your body, at least to a point. So the idea that if you cut a hole in your gut, your intestines just sort of fall out isn't really entirely accurate. They do have a lot of internal connections, and you need to actually disconnect them to make them fall completely out. But you can shift them over and out of the way and stuff like that. So not quite zombie movie, but still maneuverable. All right, these are the 4 main layers that make up all of the digestive system. The epithelial mucosa on the inside, the connective blood vessel submucosa, the muscularis to help with peristalsis, and the fibrous connective serosa to hold it all together. And that is your basics of the digestive system and digestive process.